Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to the next part of our wonderful read-through of Great Diaries, one of the, if not the, most fascinating book I have ever come across. Many of you have been enjoying this in the comments, and I really agree. This is a book that, outside of recording the read-throughs, I will be poring over in great detail. There is so much inspiration in the content, so much history, and viewing history through a very specific lens. And today's part brings us up to part 5 of the book, between 1860 and the 1900s, so actually quite a short time period in this book, only 40 years. But it's because we saw a proliferation of diaries and other personal records. So without much further ado, let's take a look at 1860 to 1900. Here we have Mary Chestnut, a diarist, who produced 7 surviving volumes and 2 notebooks in America during the American Civil War, it looks, yes. So it's recognised as one of the finest personal accounts of the American Civil War. She was born in South Carolina to a family of plantation owners in the American South, whose wealth depended on the work of black slaves. She kept a diary in 1861 as the country slid towards civil war, and stopped in 1865, soon after it had ended after the defeat of the South. She was present on the 12th of April 1861 when the Union held Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor was shelled by Confederate artillery, the first shots of the Civil War. The Confederate leadership here as well. Here we have her writings. She writes here about being increasingly overwhelmed by the increasing pace of events at the end of 1860. I wonder if it be a sin to think slavery a curse to any land. God forgive us, but ours is a monstrous system, and wrong and iniquity. This only I see, like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resemble the white children, and every lady tells you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household. But those in her own she seems to think drop from the clouds, or pretends so to think. My disgust sometimes is boiling over. Very interesting viewpoint. She wrote that on the 18th of March 1861. Here we have John Muir, a conservationist, Scottish, 84 volumes he produced. I only went out for a walk and finally concluded to stay out till sundown, for going out, I found, was really going in. Inspired by the great outdoors, and brought up in a strict religious family, first in Scotland and then in the American Midwest, he went on to become a leading conservationist, often known as the father of the national parks. Interesting inspiration here. When an accident almost blinded him in one eye, he decided to follow his dreams of exploration and set off on a walk around 1,600 kilometers or 994 miles from Kentucky to Florida. He didn't follow any set route, but wanted to go by the wildest, least trodden way. Reminds me a little bit of the Jonathan McCandless book, Into the Wild, and the subsequent Sean Penn and Emil Hirsch movie, one of my favourites actually. I think it taps into such a deeply rich fantasy that many of us have to break free from the constraints of urban and working environments and straitjackets, and just simply move off into the wilderness, become self-sustainable. But seems so difficult to just do, right? Here's a quote from his journal. It's been and said that trees are imperfect men, and seem to bemoan their imprisonment rooted in the ground, but they never seem so to me. I never saw a discontented tree. Good point. They grip the ground as though they liked it, and though fast-rooted, they travel about as far as we do. They go wandering forth in all directions with every wind, going and coming like ourselves, travelling with us around the sun 2,000,000 miles a day, and through space heaven knows how fast and far. Lovely quote, that. President Theodore Roosevelt here accompanied Muir on a camping trip in Yosemite. He saw it as an opportunity to do some forest good in talking freely around the campfire, and persuaded Roosevelt to create Yosemite National Park, the first of 5 such national parks that received the president's backing. Wow, this, I don't think I'd heard of John Muir before, but what an incredibly influential individual he is. A real advocate for the great outdoors and to preserve it for future generations. What an actual legend. Here's a view from the vicarage by Francis Gilford, a British clergyman. And it points a vivid picture of rural life in Victorian Britain. And interestingly contains such striking self-portrait of a clergyman whose attitudes and behaviour contradict many stereotypes of his era and profession. Let's find out how he did that then. He comes across as a sympathetic, unstuffy, modest and good-natured, with a keen eye for the beauty of nature and the opposite sex. Oh, okay. He's conscientious in his duties. He describes harrowing visits to parishioners living in abject poverty, often blighted by loneliness, illness or insanity. But his own world is that of the rural elite, with picnics and dinners and holidays by the sea, enjoying croquet and the new fad for lawn tennis. He can be thoroughly irreverent, as in his hilarious description of pallbearers at a funeral almost crushed by the weight of the coffin. He's also enthusiastic about swimming in the nude, and enjoys flirtatious talk with young women. Modern readers might take issue with some of his attitudes. Only 3 of the 22 notebooks he keeps still exist today, but here's a quote from it. Bathing yesterday and today at Shankling, one has to adopt the detestable custom of bathing in drawers. If ladies don't like to see men naked, why don't they keep away from the sight? Today I had a pair of drawers given me which I could not keep on. The rough waves stripped them off and tore them down round my ankles. While thus fettered, I was seized and flung down by a heavy sea which was retreating, suddenly left me lying naked on the sharp shingle from which I rose streaming with blood. After this I took the wretched, dangerous rag off, and of course there were some ladies looking on as I came up out of the water. Right, I wonder if he was a bit of an exhibitionist then. And that attitude of, it's not my fault, it's yours. Interesting fellow. A very famous individual, of course, Vincent Van Gogh. Vincent Van Gogh. I never know the right way to pronounce that. I should look that up, shouldn't I? Can somebody tell me in the comments, is it Van Gogh, like a cough, or is it Go? Around 800 letters, Dutch. So he writes effectively diary-like letters, 800 entries, that's incredible. More than 800 of them have survived, which of course give an insight into his daily life struggles with health and his creative process, as well as sketches of pictures that he was working on and the ideas that inspired them. Interesting. He hoped that other painters would join him in Arles, in an area in the south of France, and that he would form a new artist colony. But his dream was soon dashed when Paul Gauguin came, lured by financial assistance from Theo Van Gogh's brother. It was a disaster. There was a violent quarrel. Gauguin fled, and then the famous incident whereby, in a fit of despair, Van Gogh sliced off part of his left ear and delivered it to a local prostitute. His physical wound healed soon enough, and he began working again at a furious pace, but the mental scars remained, however, and in 1890, less than 2 years after his crisis in Arles, Van Gogh took his own life. hallucinations or madness. We get along like members of the same family," he says to his brother from the hospital in Arles on the 3rd of February 1889. 3rd of February being my birthday, actually, which is interesting. Wow, look at this letter. And he's got an illustration in there as well. This is a letter to his brother while he was staying in a rural part of Holland. He painted the peasants at work and expressed his determination to make a success of being a painter, using the drawing to underline his point. "One must undertake things with confidence, like our friend below, who is dragging his own harrow." The quote here, to his brother around the 25th of October. "I myself feel, to the point of being mentally crushed and physically drained, the need to produce precisely because, in short, I have no other means, none of ever recouping our outlay. I can do nothing about it if my paintings don't sell. The day will come, though, when people will see that they're worth more than the cost of the paint and my subsistence. Very meagre, in fact, but my dear brother, my debt is so great that when I've paid it, the hardship of producing paintings will have taken my entire life, and it will seem to me that I haven't lived." Very tragic tale of Vincent Van Gogh, of course, is the terrible twist being how his work is inconceivably more valuable posthumously than in his life, and it was what he dreamed of. Look at this wonderful detail here. For much of his life he was rootless and isolated, moved home frequently and was unable to hold down a romantic relationship, and also had a tendency to take things to excess. He lost his job as a lay preacher when, out of sympathy for the poor, he began giving away all of his own possessions. And when he was painting at Arles, he put his health at risk by working long hours outdoors, day after day, in the searing heat. Look at these lovely illustrations here. In short, looking at the painting should rest the mind, or rather the imagination. About his bedroom at Arles painting here. This sewer, a letter written in English to the Australian artist John Peter Russell in June 1888. He painted several versions of the sewer at this time, before and after his clash with Gauguin, and he was strongly drawn to the theme. It's peasant culture, but also has biblical overtones. In later versions, the sun was swollen to an enormous size, dominating the scene. He's including as well to the artist a specification of the colours he wanted to use: violet for the field and yellow for the sun and the sky. Anthony Gaudi, the architect, the famous Spanish architect who, of course, designed the expiatory church of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, that incredible fairy tale-like building in Barcelona, if you're familiar with it. He was a visionary who created unique mansions, parks and churches that were both beautiful and bizarre, and historians have long been keen to study him and anxious to learn the secrets of his fertile imagination, but there's limited source material. Unfortunately, during the Spanish Civil War, his office in the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona was looted and most of the records destroyed, but his student notebook, the manuscript of Royce, had been moved to safety. I've forgotten about, actually, until the 1960s, when it was rediscovered by the biographer César Martinel. It's a beautiful set of handwritten notes, student notes. So interesting, isn't it, to see that the genesis of somebody at their learning stage, and they're written as a diary here. It contains details of his coursework and his early thoughts on architecture, alongside numerous plans, drawings and sketches. The quote here: "The house is the small nation of the family. The independent family has its own house. What it does not have is a house for rent. The house itself is the native country, and the rental house is the land of emigration. This is why the house itself is ideal for all. The house, we imagine, has two objectives. First are its hygienic conditions, which make those who grow and develop in it into strong and robust beings, and second are its artistic conditions, which endow them as much as possible with our proverbial integrity of character." His project, he tackled a wide variety of assignments, ranging from an ornamental fountain designed a royal wharf to a monumental gateway for a cemetery. This is a design for a university assembly hall and a presentation in his final exam. What a quality work. I mean, he's absolutely right, though. I completely agree with his sentiment here about what a home should be. The problem I think we have in this day and age, as well as the sheer need for housing, means that, of course, we focus on quantity over quality and place human beings sometimes into living arrangements that don't necessarily allow the artistic conditions. But then that sounds like something somebody from a place of immense privilege would say as well, of course. So it's a tricky subject. Here we have the work of a social reformer, Beatrice Webb, a sociologist. She was a leading reformer, one of the most influential people in the history of English socialism, working for most of her life with her husband, Sidney. She was one of the founders of the London School of Economics, LSE, of course, very famous further education institution. So the writings and research form the basis of the social welfare system introduced in Britain decades later. Interesting. Again, somebody that I think I may have heard of in passing, a name in passing, but so crucial to the economic and social landscape of England today. Her influence was enormous, but she occasionally doubted her own abilities, a quality that helps to make her even more sympathetic in her diaries. She used the diaries as a source for the first volume of her autobiography, My Apprenticeship. She did not live to publish any later volumes. The diaries are the best account of her full life. She was 15 when her father, the businessman Richard Potter, took her with him on a trip to America. She visited New York and Chicago and saw Niagara Falls. So this is a picture of Chicago Street. Sometimes Sidney and I feel that we can hardly repay by our work the happiness and joy of our life. It seems so luxurious to be able to choose what work one will do according to one's faith in its usefulness, and do that work in loving comradeship. The next 10 years will prove whether we were right in devoting our energies to the establishment of a science of society, and whether the amount of scientific work we have mapped out for ourselves is not beyond our powers. Wow. On this page from the 26th of March 1896, Webb describes how the idea for a political science library for the LSE came in a flash across Sidney's mind. She then explains how, having tried various sources of money in vain, they had to appeal to the public for funds for the library. This was successful, and eventually helped to establish the LSE as one of the major research centres for political science. Of course, I'd imagine her thinkings then led to things like the national health system, national insurance, etc. We have a very famous author here, Arthur Conan Doyle. Of course, famous as the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Actually, he trained as a doctor. I didn't know that, in his native Edinburgh. And in 1880, when he was still a young medical student, was offered the chance to go on a voyage to the Arctic as a ship's surgeon. It was a whaling ship, and he kept a journal of his experiences during the 6-month journey. How interesting. Talking about his medical duties on the ship and work at sea, venturing onto the ice to hunt seals, working against the bitter cold. He didn't publish this, but it was the basis for numerous factual articles. Some of his short stories, such as The Captain of the Pole Star, are also based on events that happened during this journey, so he clearly treasured it and kept it for the rest of his life. When I got my head above the hatchway, the very first thing I saw was the whale shooting its head out of the water and gambolling about at the other side of a large sconce piece of ice. It was a beautiful night with hardly a ripple on the deep green water. In jumped the crews into their boats, and the officer of the watch looked that their guns were primed and ready. Then they pushed off, and the 2 long whale boats went crawling away on their wooden legs. The journey of the SS Hope was not a great financial success. The expedition caught only 2 whales, along with 2,400 seals. How big are these ships? On the 17th of April, Conan Doyle writes Nothing Doing All Day. His humorous pen and ink sketches depict not only members of the crew, but also a hawk scouring the ocean for prey with the aid of a telescope. A lovely fold-out watercolour there of the whalers in 2 rowing boats. Here's a little bit of context about whaling. They were hunted mainly for their blubber, which was a source of valuable oil, but also for whalebone, which was used to stiffen corsets. Glad that practice is gradually phasing out across the planet. Gradually, he says. Beatrix Potter, writer and illustrator. My children are very big fans of Peter Rabbit, so it's lovely to see Beatrix Potter here. Of course, he resided in the wonderful Lake District. Really, I keep talking about the Lake District, and if you've never been, I seriously advocate for taking a journey there, taking a trip there. She kept a journal for 16 years, and she stopped writing in it well before she published any of her famous children's books, such as The Tale of Peter Rabbit or The Tailor of Gloucester. And it covers her feelings as a writer, and she led a sheltered life with her parents, spending much of her time in the house where she was born in London. But during the summer and early autumn, the family regularly stayed in a rented house in the Lake District, where she walked, relaxed, lost herself in nature, and developed an interest in drawing and studying mushrooms, on which she later published scientific articles. So the descriptions of the places she visited in the Lake District and of animals were the most vivid passages of her journal, so were likely the inspiration. I say fearlessly that Michelangelo is hideous and badly drawn. I wouldn't give tuppence for it except as a curiosity. Well, Beatrix Potter has spoken. And there's a secret code, interesting. The code that Potter invented for her journal is based on a simple letter substitution system, which involves replacing one letter or symbol for another. Once she'd grown used to the code, she could write very quickly, making her handwriting harder to decipher. And it was many years before the journal was finally decoded by Potter expert Leslie Linder, but it took him several years to complete the task. Wow, all in code as well. Stunning. This is just pure code. Looks like a random assortment of letters. We had a great pleasure watching a pair of buzzards sailing round and round over the top of Wansfell. There was an old shepherd halfway up the side of Troutbeck, much bent and gesticulating with a stick. He watched the collies scouring round over stone walls, coming close past us without taking the slightest notice. 4 or 5 sheep looped over a wall at least 3 feet high on our right and escaped the dog's observation, whereupon the ancient shepherd, a mere speck in the slanting sunlight down the great hillside, awoke the echoes with a flood of the most singularly bad language. Lovely account. And look, here we have it in detail. Wonderful. Look at the illustrations. Look at the rabbits. Oh, lovely. Peter Piper, Potter's pet rabbit, has his claws trimmed. So that's why Peter Rabbit is called Peter. There's a picture of Beatrix with her first rabbit on a leash there. Her first rabbit, Benjamin Bouncer, again another character in the stories. Oh, this is lovely to read about. He went on holiday with the family, and Potter took him for walks on a long string lead. And then Benjamin's successor was Peter Piper, who followed her everywhere. Oh, this is wonderful. This is a picture letter to Noel Moore, showing Potter creating the mixture of simple narrative and animal illustrations that became her trademark. When she first offered her stories to a publisher, the drawings were simple line illustrations similar to those of the snowballing rabbits in this letter. However, her publisher persuaded her to redraw them in colour, which she thought would be more appealing to children. Here is lovely watercolour of the Lake District here. And interesting, although Potter sold some illustrations she made for other people's books, she could not find a publisher for The Tale of Peter Rabbit, the first book she wrote. She decided to publish it herself, mainly for friends and family, and illustrated it with simple line drawings of the rabbits who act like humans and wear clothes. When her small print run came out, Warren, the publisher, who had previously rejected the book, offered to publish it. She accepted the offer, and Warren's edition, with colour illustrations, came out in 1902. Soon became a bestseller, and Potter followed it up with many more stories in the same small format. All of them sold well, but the mischievous Peter Rabbit was probably her most popular character. I love that. What a lovely discovery. Thomas Alva Edison, of course, the famous American inventor. Perhaps the most famous American inventor of all time. Known perhaps for inventing the incandescent light bulb and phonograph. That is if, of course, you're subscribing to the thought that he invented those things and perhaps didn't lift the ideas from somebody else, which I know is a number of theories out there, but we could leave that for another day. He only kept a diary for a short period, and this was when he took his first long break from work in many years and went to stay at the house of his friend Gilliland on the coast of Massachusetts. And he'd already produced a number of his most famous inventions here, but science and technology is scarcely mentioned. So instead he records in a chatty tone what he's done each day, what he's reading, his thoughts on art, literature and religion. And he's still looking for a wife, apparently. So this is an interesting internal monologue of somebody who we know for one thing, but perhaps giving us an additional dimension to the individual. The diary alternates between records of Edison's daily activities and the reflections on events taking place in the United States. Here he vents his anger at the press's treatment of John Roach, who had risen from poverty to become America's largest shipbuilder, only to lose much of his fortune when the government cancelled a contract and the banks blocked planned loans. Dot, who was Edison's daughter, just read to me outlines of her proposed novel. The basis seems to be a marriage under duress. I told her that in case of a marriage to put in bucketfuls of misery. This would make it realistic. Speaking of realism in painting, for example, Steele Mackay told us of a definition of modern realism by giving some Frenchman whose name I've forgotten realism, a dirty long-haired painter sitting on the head of a bust of Shakespeare painting a pair of old boots covered in dung. The bell rings for supper. I go. Sardines, the principal attraction. Wow, quite a straight-talking man. Here we have the social observer, the French author Jules Renard, a warm, witty man with brilliant powers of observation. Began to keep a journal when he was in his early 20s and carried on till the end of his life, 4 volumes of diaries. So during a period in France known as the Belle Epoque, a time of peace, prosperity and social change, during which the arts flourished. And it's an interesting insight into it. The most popular of his works is Boiled Carrot Top, a short semi-autobiographical novel about Francois Lepic, an unloved red-headed child based on Renard himself. It's now regarded as a classic of French literature. So this is the first published manuscript of his journal. And his widow had destroyed the manuscripts after his death, so this is the earliest text available, unfortunately. Paris is becoming fantastic, he says. Those buzzers without horses. You seem to be living in the land of shades, and this thought comes back to me. Are we all dead without knowing it? In these sounds, reflections in this mist, you walk in anxiety, less with the fear of being run over than with the pulp from the noise. All kinds of smoke. The blue, light smoke, the white, the grey, the heavy black, all go up to the azure and are lost, and the azure remains. There are no leaves left. The wind blows only to make a fuss. Year's end. Our last energy falls away like leaves. Wonderful poetic language there. And here we have Gauguin, who we mentioned earlier in relation to Van Gogh. And we have an artist's journals here. He says he has two natures, a savage and a civilized man. And this idea stemmed from childhood memories of when he was living in Peru, and he tried to develop the savage side of himself by attempting to be at one with nature, free from what he saw as bourgeois European constraints. For a time he tried to pursue his dreams in Brittany, steeped in its ancient Celtic traditions, but a visit to a replica Tahitian village in the World's Fair of 1889 inspired him to look further afield. He abandoned his Danish wife and 5 children, oh dear, and set off for the South Seas. In reality, Tahiti was a disappointment. It was westernized, colonial, and missionaries were suppressing native traditions. Gauguin himself accepted government grants to fund his travels and used his privileged colonial status to exploit young Tahitian women. In his art, he created a paradise he had hoped to find. He painted young girls in colourful fabrics rather than the dresses that missionaries encouraged them to wear, and introduced symbols from the island's waning culture. He had gained a reputation in Brittany, but returned to France a forgotten man, and the painting sold poorly, so he decided to write an account of his time there to help the public understand his new work. Noah Noah was written as a journal, but it was really a pretext for publicising his romanticised persona as a savage. It remained unfinished at his death. Every day gets better for me. In the end, I understand the language quite well. My neighbours regard me almost as one of themselves. My naked feet, from daily contact with the rock, have got used to the ground. My body, almost quite naked, no longer fears the sun. Civilization leaves me bit by bit, and I begin to think simply, and I function in an animal way, freely, with the certainty of the morrow being like today. I become carefree, calm, and loving. An interesting character who had a very romanticised view of himself. Alfred Dreyfus, an artillery captain from France. And this man was, for 1,517 days, imprisoned on a remote island. He railed against his conviction for treason using the only means available, a pen and paper. Catalogued his despair into his diary and thousands of letters to his wife Lucy and to the French authorities. So his liberty had been sacrificed to maintain the prestige of the French military as the only Jewish officer on the general staff. He was the chief suspect when intelligence intercepted a list of minor French military secrets that had been passed to the German embassy. So a faint similarity to his handwriting was enough to convict him. He turns repeatedly to the pain of separation from his wife and 2 young children. The fevers of malaria that brought him close to his death, the poisonous spider crabs and biting insects in his fetid hut, and the security measures that denied him walks outdoors. He was kept in solitary confinement with all of his correspondence censored, and was unaware of the crisis in France, known as the Dreyfus affair, that would eventually clear his name. After a revision of sentence was granted in November 1898, he was allowed to see the ocean for the first time in years. In Rennes, France, Dreyfus was found guilty in a corrupt retrial and accepted a pardon to keep his liberty. He was exonerated of all charges in 1906. Oh, wow, this man really had it. How sad. Haunted by injustice. And a nation divided about his incarceration. They will certainly end by killing me through repeated suffering, or by forcing me to seek in suicide and escape from insanity. The opprobrium of my death will be on Commandant Bertillon and all those who have improved their hands in this iniquity. Each night I dream of my wife and children, but what terrible awakenings. When I open my eyes and find myself in this hut, I have a moment of such anguish that I could close my eyes forever, never to see or think again. Evening, violent heart spasms with frequent paroxysms of suffocation. A testament to man's endurance, humanity's endurance and will. Here we have a nomad in the Sahara, Isabel Eberhart, the explorer. Her writings reveal a short but extraordinary life. She was the illegitimate fifth child of a Russian general's wife who eloped to Switzerland with the Russian anarchist tutor of her children. She grew up in Geneva in 1877. Growing up, she and her siblings had an unconventional education. They then sailed to Tunis in 1897, her and her mother, where they both converted to Islam. Her mother died 6 months later, but Isabel felt more born in North Africa and remained there. Discarding her European identity and clothes, she reinvented herself as a young male Arab with the name Mahmud Saad. She became an Islamic mystic or Sufi, learned Arabic, lived among the poor, smoked hashish, had affairs, and travelled through the wild and more remote regions of North Africa. Interesting. Very interesting. The papers blend autobiography with travel writing and anecdotes from conversations. She was a regular correspondent from 1902 for a French newspaper in Algiers. She drowned at the age of 27 when the town she was staying in 1904 was hit by a flash flood. And the editor of the newspaper for which she wrote, Victor Barocand, completed some of their unfinished work and published it. What an interesting life. Among these brave people, I am completely at ease. I entered into their midst and sat down in a corner of the courtyard. They didn't even notice me. Of course, there's nothing remarkable about me. I'm able to pass everywhere completely unobserved, an excellent position to be in for observing. If women are not good at this, it's because their costume attracts attention. Women have always been made to be looked at, and they aren't yet much bothered by the fact. This attitude, I think, gives far too much advantage to men. Marie Curie, the physicist and chemist, one of the most influential scientists of all time, of course, for her pioneering work on radioactivity, winning Nobel Prizes for physics and chemistry. The first woman to be made a professor at the University of Paris. She kept there are three surviving notebooks, and she was continuing the research of French physicist Henri Becquerel, who had discovered in 1896 that uranium salts emitted rays. They described the methods the Curies used to try and isolate the elements within pitchblende and track the progress they made. They discovered polonium in 1898, which they named after Marie's native Poland. Didn't know that. And in December they discovered radium. Another 12 years before Marie managed to isolate the pure metal radium from pitchblende and prove its existence definitely. So the notebooks are a record of this groundbreaking work in the laboratory. Amazing. And of course, at the time no one knew about the dangers of radioactivity, so they didn't wear protective clothing or take precautions, and the notebooks themselves are so radioactive that they have to be kept in lead-lined boxes. Incredible. I think I heard that somewhere, that all of her work, yes, has been kept in lead-lined boxes because they are just also radioactive. And they will remain dangerous to handle for at least 1,500 years. Incredible. Of course, other journals are mentioned here as well, like Dr. David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary, Charles Benson, Alexander Graham Bell, Tchaikovsky, and that brings us up to which is a good place to pause for now. So thank you so much for joining me for this next part of Great Diaries. What a fantastic book this is. Getting a huge amount of value out of this. It's very enriching. Hope you've enjoyed it too. And I look forward to having you join me next time for more Great Diaries, the world's most remarkable diaries, journals, notebooks, and letters. Until next time.